Welcome to anybody watching outside Parliament buildings. You're very...
Alex too. So.
Oh, and Alex has just joined us as well, so we have a quorum. Hi, Alex. So you're very welcome to the weekly meeting of the Executive Office Committee. And I just want to thank Rachel and Elaine for holding on there, and we'll come to you shortly. Members, before we go any further, are there any matters of declarations of interest? No. So welcome all members to the meeting, and those in the room are Pat Sheehan and Trevor Lunn, and online via Starleaf we have Diane Dodds, Alex Easton and Padraig Delargy. So you're all very welcome. The committee meeting will be recorded and broadcast throughout Parliament buildings and online. And just to inform members and members of the public that due to plenary business, there may be quorum issues throughout the day. Also, if plenary business advances quickly, the meeting may have to be suspended to allow members to contribute to the debate on the Fair Employment School Teachers Bill, should this start early. I need to advise members that the use of mobile phones are allowed, but they need to be on airplane mode and they can connect to the Assembly Wi-Fi. And if members are content, we'll proceed through the agenda. Firstly, apologies. I have one written apology, and that's from Sinead McLaughlin, the Chair, and we send our best wishes to Sinead, who is not well at the minute. And Sinead, I'm sure you're tuned in, and if you are, best wishes for a speedy recovery. Are there any other apologies? But Amos Sheeran, did you say?
Sorry, I'm speaking at a plenary debate, so she may be in at some stage.
No problem. Thank you for that. Moving on, we have Chairperson's business, and I refer members to the correspondence from the Rosetta Trust circulated to members by email this morning. I need to inform you that the review report was submitted to the department on Friday, and the terms of reference to the review state under section 4 that a final report on the review will be submitted after fact-checking by the reviewer to the First Minister and Deputy First Minister for consideration, along with any decisions needed outside normal operational issues. It is envisaged that the report will be made available to the TU Assembly Committee and to victims and survivors. Can I seek agreement from members to write to the Department to urge that fact-checking takes place with all due haste to enable the report and recommendations to be shared with victims and survivors and this committee at the earliest opportunity, especially given the time constraints and the fact that the apology is next week? Are members happy with that?
I would agree with that. Chair, I'm just wondering, are victims and survivors going to get sight of the recommendations before the apology?
I think that's something that victims and survivors groups have reached out to me, and I'm sure to yourself and others about, and that is still up in the air. You would like to think that that is provided, but I haven't had any clarification from that. I don't know, Michael, if we've heard anything additional to that. I don't believe we have.
No, it's just in terms of the fact that the report was only received by the department on Friday, and for that fact-checking to take place, and I think our letter to them would cover that, to ask for them to expedite that with all due speed. Mm-hmm.
Similar to yourself, Chair, I mean, victims groups have been in touch with me and they're anxious to see the recommendations before the apology. They think that that's an imperative in this whole process. They'll see these recommendations beforehand. So, I mean, I suppose we're a bit in the dark, and I don't know whether any more information can be gleaned anywhere about that. I'm looking at the clerk. Is there any information?
I assume too, Pat, that there is a point of contact within the department to act as a liaison directly with victims groups. I'm assuming that would be one of the fundamental roles of that, to keep them updated on a daily basis about these developments, to set aside any of those concerns. I'm saying that should happen. I don't know if it is, but you'd like to think it would be. Can we just check?
Yeah, it's my understanding, Chair, that there is constant communication between an individual in the department and the victims groups, victims survivors groups. Yeah.
Well, if we get that off, that would be very helpful, and hopefully they can respond as quickly as possible. Sorry, Pat.
I'm just concerned that, albeit there is some sort of liaison there with the groups are anxious for a reason. Mm-hmm. The reason being that they haven't seen the recommendations. And I'm just thinking that if this sort of choreography goes ahead but the victims aren't included in that choreography.
Absolutely.
It's going to do more damage than good. So it's just important that this is got right, I think.
Absolutely. Well, that letter to TO will probably go off today, and I'd like to think that they can get a response back to us by the end of this week. I don't see any reason why that can't happen. We'll push all we can to get those answers for victims and survivors. Refer members, next item, to correspondence from the department circulated by email yesterday setting out the position in relation to the junior ministers. And just need to inform you that the request to brief the committee that was requested last week is currently under consideration. That's the request that the junior ministers come and brief us. So we're still waiting on something in relation to that. Does anyone have any comment on that? No. And just to inform you that due to unforeseen circumstances with the chair, the group photograph for the committee legacy report has had to be rearranged. And I need to seek agreement from members to rearrange the group photograph, ideally for Monday, the 7th of March at 2 p.m, if that would suit. That's this Monday coming.
Monday at 2.
Monday at 2. Okay.
Well, it just depends on what's
What's
happening
happening
in question time.
Yeah. I think we can be flexible on the ground, possibly, if we need to be. Just to inform you that the Chair attended the launch of the Interparliamentary Forum on Friday the 25th of February at the House of Lords. Members of the Scottish Parliament, Northern Ireland Assembly, House of Commons, House of Lords and the Welsh Senate agreed priorities for future work programme of the IBF, including the operation of international agreements, including the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the Withdrawal Agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol, the UK Internal Market, including the UK Internal Market Act and Commons Framework, and the impact of new constitutional arrangements on the legislative process, including the use of secondary powers and legislative consent process. Moving on to the draft minutes, just need to inform you that the draft minutes of the meeting held on 23rd of February 2022.
Chair, did you want to mention?
Oh yes, thank you very much, Michael. If it hadn't been for you. Another item under Chair's business is a late one. We got correspondence just this afternoon from Chris Little MLA, who's the sponsor of the Fair Employment School Teachers Bill. And he's written, and I'll read out the email and then allow members to give thoughts on it. It says, thank you for your proactive and partnership approach to the Fair Employment School Teachers Bill. Further to the increasing clear support and lack of concern or suggested amendments for the provisions of the Fair Employment School Teachers Bill, and on the proviso that it completes the second stage today, I am writing to ask if it would be possible for the TO to write to the Business Committee to request that it schedules dispensing with the 5-day requirements if necessary, further consideration of final stages of the bill at its meeting of Tuesday the 8th of March on the grounds that the TO will complete its committee stage and agree its committee report on or before Wednesday the 9th of March 2022. There appears to be a real opportunity for a single but important and well-supported law to be passed by us all before the end of this mandate, and I'm very grateful for the work of the TO committee that has made this possible. Best regards. Members will know that we've had some evidence already, quite comprehensive evidence on this, and there is virtually unanimous support from all who give evidence supporting this private member's bill, and I think we're all agreed that if any could sneak through in the time frame that was allowed, this would probably be one of them, given how narrow the legislation of the private member's bill is. But we also have to operate within the frameworks and the time constraints that are here, and also with the business office. So I'm just wanting to put it out to members what they think. We're not planning to complete our report until the last week of the mandate. Is that right, Michael?
That's right, yeah.
But there is a request there from Chris Little MLA that we look at this was expedient in the process. Just wonder if members have any thoughts on the course of action.
Well, I would be broadly in agreement with that. It seems to be that there isn't any opposition to repealing this piece of legislation. I think the last objections were from CCMS and the Catholic trustees, and we discovered last week that they're not opposed to repealing this legislation. So all the other stakeholders seem to be in agreement. It's a good piece of legislation, certainly in principle anyway, and I think if there's some way that we can move this process forward quickly, we should certainly explore all avenues. I would be in favour of that.
I would be in agreement as well. I think I made that point last week that we should do all we can, given just how short it is, but what a difference it will make, and how it is possible that this could get through where others at this second stage probably won't get through because of division within them and difficulties with the way they've been drafted. I think this is one that has a real chance. So I would support the idea of doing it. Whether it gets through at the next stage via the Speaker's Office is a different matter. Trevor?
Yeah, well, I would agree with both of you. If it can be done, let's do it. I can hear the arguments already about creating a precedent and rushing legislation and so on. There's probably not the only virtually single line bill that's in the process. And also, there's so little, there's no opposition to it. It could be brought back in the next mandate quite early. If there is a next mandate, frankly. And but assuming there is, it wouldn't be the end of the world if the protocols and procedures up here ruled it out for now. Okay. You know, a few months' time, we could probably go through anyway. But I hope we can do it.
Yeah. Well, my sense then that we do right requesting that, and that we as a committee feel that we can truncate our committee stage and our evidence gathering and bring that forward, allow that to happen. Given that it will then kick the ball into the court of the Speaker's Office anyway, he'll need to decide whether they're willing to forego those processes. Are there any online that want to contribute to this? Nope. Okay. Are you happy with the course of action then, Michael?
Yes, that's fine. We'll write to the Speaker's Office asking for it to be scheduled with the proviso that the committee finishes its committee stage on Wednesday.
Okay, that's great. Moving on to item 3 on the agenda, the draft minutes from the 23rd of February 2022, pages 6 to 11. Are members content that they are a true and accurate reflection of the meeting?
Content, sure.
Yeah.
Item 4, matters arising. Just need to remind you, members, at last week's meeting, the committee received an oral brief by the Integrated Education Fund and the Ulster University on Fair Employment School Teachers Bill. And I refer members to pages 13 to 24 of the meeting pack for the presentation that was provided by the University of Ulster. And to remind you of calls of evidence in relation to the bill close on Monday the 7th of March, and the committee will consider options. We've just discussed that as well at next week's meeting. Item 5, we're on to our oral briefing today, and that's on tackling violence against women and girls strategy. And we have presentations from the Women's Resource and Development Agency, oral briefing. Members, just refer you to pages 25 to 403 of the meeting pack and pages 3 to 109 of the table pack for the relevant papers. And to remind members that the committee held its stakeholder event in relation to the strategy to tackle violence against women and girls last Thursday, which WRDA attended, and a summary of the paper of the main issues from stakeholders will be included in next week's pack. And I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome Rachel Powell from Women's Sector Lobbyist, Women's Resource and Development Agency, and Elaine Crory, Good Relations Coordinator, Women's Resource and Development Agency. You're very welcome to the meeting. Thank you very much for your patience, and advise you that the video of the meeting will be made available on the committee webpage. We'll invite you to speak both, and then we'll take questions from members if you're happy enough with that. And thank you very much. I'll allow you to carry on now.
Yes, thank you, Vice Chair. I'm just going to share my screen as I have a presentation, so hopefully you'll be able to see this okay. No. Can everyone see that okay?
Yep, that's fine, thank you.
Great. So I'll just start. My name is Rachel Powell. I'm the Women's Sector Lobbyist with the Women's Resource and Development Agency. And I'd like to thank the Chair for inviting us to come and present today. I'll just hand over to my colleague Elaine.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. We're doing this presentation together. The idea is we're going to give an overview of the research, the findings of the research that we have done so far. We had an enormous response to this research, so a full detailed breakdown will be in our written response to the call for views.
Now, can I just confirm that the slide has changed for you all on your end?
It has indeed, Rachel, yep.
Perfect, thank you. So a bit of background then. The Women's Policy Group is a group of women working in policy and research roles who are experts in a wide range of gender-based policy, and this includes women's sector, lobbyists, NGOs, trade unions, LGBT groups, migrant groups, activists, women's networks, and more. Our main function really is to work on policy and advocacy to ensure that the needs of women is embedded within all forms of legislation and policy making. We released our Feminist Recovery Plan in 2020 and then relaunched our plan in 2021, which I know that we have sent to the members of this committee. And a lot of the recommendations from within that will also be going into our written evidence submission to the Executive Office. But just in summary then of who we are, the Women's Policy Group is endorsed as a group of advocates on behalf of women in Northern Ireland on a policy level, and we use our collective expertise on protected characteristics and the intersectional needs of women. So myself and Elena are from WRDA, but I am the chair of the Women's Policy Group, and this is a research project that has been alongside up to 60 of our other members.
So regarding this particular piece of research, we launched a survey open to members of the public to really add texture and detail to our response to the call for views. We already had a significant amount of work that we had done over the last couple of years, particularly around violence against women and girls, but we saw this as an opportunity that we couldn't pass up to do some research of our own. Firstly, because often we find ourselves relying on data that comes from PSNI statistics, PPS statistics and so on, but that data isn't a full picture. And, you know, the PSNI and the PPS would admit that themselves. It's not the full picture because not everybody reports acts of violence that they experience. And indeed, in some cases, the law isn't there to capture truly the nature of what happened to people. So we wanted to get that evidence, if you will, straight from the horse's mouth. We also knew that evidence-based policy making is the best way to make policy, and you can't do that without the evidence. So I think, by and large, the results of this really demonstrate that this call for views has sort of filled a gap that was there because lots of people wanted to tell their stories and wanted us to use them to make our recommendations. Our whole approach in the Women's Policy Group is putting the lived experiences of women at the core of our policy recommendations. And we find that women often say that government websites, government surveys, consultations and so on, they're kind of inaccessible to them. Sometimes they're overly long. Sometimes the fact that they have to be done online and you can't go back and revise your answers and so on, you have to hit submit at the end of each one, can be quite difficult. And sometimes people feel like they don't know the answers to the questions that are asked because sometimes they're quite specific, quite technical. And so people are often shy away from those things, but they're happy to give us the information so that we can use it to answer the questions on their behalf.
So we're going to give you a bit of an overview of today's results. Can I just check, can you see me or can you only see the presentation? You can?
We can see both.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. So we will be submitting a much more detailed response to the TEO call for views, and we will share this also with all committee members as well. We're also going to do a supplementary report outside of the call for views going into much more detail, which will go into detail again about our research methodology. But to briefly summarise, we made this an anonymous online survey and also conducted some individual interviews. This involved a mix of qualitative and quantitative questions. A lot of the quantitative questions we made required. A handful we decided should be optional given the triggering nature of those responses. But even with the optional qualitative responses, we received huge amounts of content from women who really wanted to share their story. We were only able to have this survey open for 25 days. We would have really loved to have had at least 6 weeks, but as has been the nature with almost every call for views and public consultation in this mandate, we haven't been given the full 12 weeks to respond, which is in line with good practice. But nonetheless, within those 25 days, we received 1,065 responses. And this was purely from organic reach with our own membership from Women's Policy Group organisations. We also used the findings from our primary research and the Feminist Recovery Plan last year to inform the questions that we wanted to ask. And we ensured that the questions within our own survey matched the questions that were being asked of us from the Executive Office and the Departments of Health and Justice. So we really have a lot of scope there to respond and provide further evidence that would not have previously been available.
So we're just going to run through the survey results now. And at the beginning, we asked people some demographic information so that we could get a notion of whether or not we were actually capturing a cross-section of the community, or if we were instead only getting from a certain small section that maybe wouldn't be representative of the experiences of all women. So that's the reason we began with asking people demographic information questions, still remaining anonymous, but just to give us an idea of who people were, and again, whether they were representative of a cross-section of women and girls across Northern Ireland.
So our first question just was to get a bit of an overview of some of the groups that are marginalised in Northern Ireland. We'll fly through these demographic questions and then get into the guts of the survey though. But as you can see, quite a broad range of people responding. Over 50% were, and just to say, sorry, it was only women and girls that were responding to this survey. So over 50% of the women responded were working class. Almost 25% didn't identify as either of these, but LGBT women were 13.3, disabled 10%, migrant community 3.1, and living in a rural area at 24.5. So you can see at the bottom of every slide of these questions how many people responded to each one.
So then we asked about age groups, and you can see there that we have a fairly decent spread. The lowest we went was 16 years old, because some of the questions relate to sexual violence, and of course we didn't want anything too upsetting or too triggering, or indeed something that people couldn't have consented to below the age of 16. But there's a significant spread there now. It is disproportionately women between sort of 35 and 60, but that's most likely people more easily reached by women's policy group membership organisations, such as, for example, women's centres and so on. They're less likely to be used by younger women. We did get, however, decent numbers from younger women as well.
So as you would expect, in terms of nationality, the majority were British or Irish or both, or Northern Irish, but we had a wide range of other women from other nationalities responding, including American, Ukrainian, Italian, Polish, Turkish, Algerian, Somali, Jamaican, Chinese, Asian, and more. We will provide more detail on all of this, but really we were quite pleased with the broad reach that we had, and this was very much down to promotion with some of our members, such as Migrant Centre NI, Belfast Multicultural Association, and more. So we really did want to try and reach a diverse range of women.
So we also asked people's ethnicity, again, to get an idea of whether or not we were actually representative of the population. The population in Northern Ireland is about 98% white, so it's not surprising to see a very high percentage of people who are white, but of course not all white people are local here. And we are happy enough that we have a fairly diverse range of people responding, otherwise actually disproportionate to the population.
One thing we would suggest, though, for the committee as this survey or this strategy progresses, is to maybe reach out to some of those groups that aren't particularly represented, like Irish travellers and Roma women. But in terms of religious group, again, what you would largely expect: Catholic, overwhelmingly the majority, then followed by not religious, then Protestant. But we also had a wide range of other religions, as well as Muslim and Hindu women responding.
So then we move into the actual sort of meat of it, the survey questions, and this is what's going to make up the majority of the content of our responses. So from the outset, the first thing we asked was, do you think that Northern Ireland has a problem with men's violence against women and girls? And we very specifically chose this language of men's violence. We wrote this survey right after the murder of Aisling Murphy and after all of the different reports that have been happening around men murdering women over the last year. So we really wanted to explore the gender dynamics of this. But quite clearly, you can see that the women that responded to this agreed with us. 91.2% said yes, Northern Ireland has a problem with men's violence against women and girls. Only 7.4% said unsure, and 1.4% said no. And that was with 1,065 responses, a compulsory question. So the next question, sorry, just waiting for it to come up here, was, do you think that Northern Ireland should have a strategy to tackle men's violence against women and girls? And again, the number is enormous, 97.2% saying yes. And you might say that we have to some degree got a biased sample here, but actually, you know, you ask the people who are most likely to be affected by the policy or the strategy in question, and that the response is emphatic. Now, as to what exactly they want to see in the strategy, some people aren't sure. And I think some of these unsure responses that people have ticked mean that they're not exactly sure what will be in it or whether it'll be effective and so on, rather than that they don't think it should exist. Although, of course, 1.6% did say no, that's still a very much minority view.
So we wanted to get a bit of an understanding of the types of violence against women and girls that exist and the understanding that women have towards these. So we asked women whether they were aware of the below forms of violence. And as you would expect, most of them have quite a high level of awareness, with domestic abuse, physical and verbal being the most well known. But we also asked about sexual abuse, online abuse, honour-based abuse, which a smaller number knew about, which shows how much education is needed in this area. Economic abuse, coercive control, again significant given the fact that new legislation is coming in on these areas, but not as many women as you would hope are aware of what they are. Sexual harassment, street harassment, emotional abuse, again, unwanted rough sex, misogynistic hate crimes, spiritual abuse, another one with limited knowledge on, workplace harassment, stalking, forced isolation from friends and family, controlling individual style and appearances, as well as systemic violence by the state, which we will come back to more later on. But over half of all respondents were aware of all types of abuse, as mentioned above.
So following on from that, we did also ask people more detail on whether there was anything we were missing, and we'll come back to that later as well. But we also asked people, in this strategy, do you think we should focus on specific forms of violence or on all of the above? Now, our preference is for all of the above, and 95.8% of people agreed with us that while some may be comparatively rare, it doesn't mean that they're not equally important and belong in the strategy as well.
So we also asked, do you think there are any forms of violence against women and girls that we have not mentioned that should be included? And as you can see, this was an optional question, but still almost half of all respondents decided to respond. But the most common recommendations here were medical abuse, gaslighting, marital rape, grooming, spiking, lack of abortion access, caste-based violence, violence against sex workers, female genital mutilation, pornography, institutional abuse, human trafficking, stealthing, sectarian abuse, homophobic and transphobic abuse, and corrective rape. Now, some of these categories would fit into some of the headings that we mentioned earlier, but these were obviously issues that women felt so strongly about that they wanted to include and reference again.
Yeah, and we'll be making sure that we weave those issues in as much as possible into our actual responses as well. So the next question was a particularly sensitive one. It was whether or not the person themselves has ever been impacted by men's violence against women and girls. Now, 83% said yes, and 15% said no. And there was still a percentage of people who weren't sure. And I think that really captures one of the reasons why this strategy has to exist, because the public narrative around these things doesn't always name things for what they are. And people sometimes take many years before they're actually certain that they were a victim of violence. Instead, they end up blaming themselves or deflecting it and saying, maybe I'm making a big deal out of nothing. And that in itself is an issue that the strategy needs to be looking at. But at the same time, 83% of 1,060 people is a significant number of people. And it does demonstrate that this type of violence is so much more common than I think people really grasp.
One thing to also note is that this was an optional question. So the fact that 1,060 out of 1,065 people who responded decided to respond to this question is really just evidence of how prevalent the issue is, as Elaine mentioned. So we split the following response then up into two sections. The first part of this was we asked women whether they would like to share any details about how they've been impacted by violence against women and girls. Again, an optional question, yet 735 women went into much more detail. And I would like to take this opportunity to read out this one testimony from one of our respondents. There were hundreds like this, but this is one that we want to share. Just a trigger warning as well for anyone watching this live, it can be quite distressing. So this woman shared with us, I was abused as a child, raped at 13. My boyfriend when I was 15 and 23. I had lots of underage sex with men who knew I was underage and enjoyed that fact. I was in a physically abusive relationship when I was 18. I always ended up in controlling, emotionally abusive relationships. My ex passed me around for sex with his friends. My ex-husband was 15 years older than me and extremely abusive. I moved to Portugal in 2017, and 7 months later I was spiked in a bar and brought to an apartment and raped. I spent over 2 years being re-traumatized going through the court system. The guy was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years in prison, but he flew back to Angola. I'm now back living in Belfast with my partner who has cheated on me repeatedly and who lies all the time. It's sad, but I feel like this is just how men are. This is one example that we wanted to share where women have been abused as young girls, then faced various forms of abuse again throughout their lives by multiple perpetrators. And this is something that's come up again and again in our research. More often than not, women will have more than one abuser in their life. It is very rarely just one form of violence by one person that they experience.
Another thing about this that's worth emphasising is very often people say, you know, colloquially, that people like ourselves who talk about these topics all the time are demonizing men. What's actually happening really is that people are coming to conclusions like this woman unfortunately has about this is just how men are. You know, very obviously we all know that that's not true in any way, statistically speaking, of the majority of men. But when it happens to you again and again, it creates these perceptions. And what we need to be doing to help both men and women is preventing this from happening again and again, preventing people from being re-victimized again and again, treating them properly when they encounter it the first time, rather than letting a vulnerable person be taken advantage of repeatedly throughout the course of their life. So the next question was, what age were you when you were first impacted by violence against women and girls? And you can see the bar chart there. It is alarming. The majority were under 20, with the single biggest percentage being under 15 years old. Some were even under 5. But if you see that age group under 15, that tallies with statistics that we have from around the world of when people first experience street harassment, sexual harassment in public spaces, in schools and so on. The average age around the world being 13 years old. And if that's alarming, it should be alarming. But the reality is, very often it takes a long time before any of that harassment reaches the sort of criminal bar and starts getting taken seriously. But by then, those young women have already developed all sorts of techniques to try and keep themselves safe. They've internalized all sorts of victim blaming language that makes them feel responsible for how they dress, where they go, who they're with, what they drink, and so on. And already their perception of the unsafeness of men has built up. So we will need to be looking at the kind of abuse that we turn a blind eye to of children, and these people are children. 82% of respondents first experienced this before the age of 20. Now, this is 425 responses, roughly equivalent to the number of people who told us their stories in the previous question, because this wasn't a required question.
So then we asked, if you have experienced or been impacted by men's violence against women and girls, did you report this to the police? And as you can see, only 21.4% said yes, that they did report it. This has been the case with previous research undertaken by the Women's Policy Group, where really low levels of women are reporting the abuse that they've faced. So just over a fifth. So this really does shine an extent on the problem and goes much further than, shows how this goes much further than police records and statistics indicate.
And then to build on that question, we then asked people, if you did report to the police, did you find it useful? And 22.6% have said yes. Now, that's 77.4%. There's all sorts of reasons why they may not have found it helpful. They may have found, in fact, that the thing they reported technically wasn't illegal, which may have, put them off engaging with the justice system ever again. They may have reported to the police and found unhelpful officers who were insensitive, ill-informed. And the PSNI are now making significant efforts in training their staff. But, we don't know if this happened last week or 10 years ago, as the case may be. And then also, of course, there's the fact that some of these people will have gone to the police, gone through the reporting process, waited to hear about a prosecution decision and found out from the PPS that in fact it's not going to be prosecuted. And they may have regretted ever having bared their soul to police in the first place. There's any number of reasons why they may have said no. But overall, if you've got this low rate of people reporting and an even lower rate of people feeling like it was a good thing to do, that word travels. Women talk, as they say. People know. You know, my sister reported and it was a waste of her time. My aunt reported and it was a waste of her time. And overall, you know, I know that the police are making a significant effort now in improving their work on violence against women and girls. And that's really good, but that takes years to actually bear fruit.
Sorry, 1 second. So then we asked women where they think what places should be involved in this violence against women and girls strategy. And as you can see, overwhelmingly there was positive support for all of these. So over 93% for every single area. I think this is important because there has been some confusion around what will be in the domestic and sexual abuse strategy and then what will then be in the violence against women and girls strategy. We firmly believe that the evidence is clear here that a violence against women and girls strategy needs to also incorporate violence that happens in domestic settings, whether that be domestic abuse or sexual abuse. But overall, you can see that public places and online social media were the most common areas where people thought that this should be included. Domestic settings then, and then followed by educational institutions were the next most common. Crucially, again, we thought it was important to ask about workplaces, religious settings, sports and leisure places, and community settings.
So these are some of the written responses that people gave us when we asked them, do you think there's anything that we haven't thought of that should be covered in terms of a physical location where this violence might happen? And some of these are particularly interesting, including things like public transport and taxis, which technically falls into public spaces, but also healthcare settings, police, presumably from police, within the army and in prisons, political institutions like councils and the assembly, courts and judicial settings, male-dominated spaces. I mean, some of these might fall under the category of educational institutions or workplaces or something like that. But some of them also fall into a grey area, and it depends on who you are in that situation. Because, of course, your experience within a prison will be very different if you're a prisoner versus if you're a prison staff. And in one case, it's a workplace. In the other case, it's not. You're held there whether you like it or not. So all of these things need to be considered, and we'll be working those into our response as much as possible.
Next, we asked some quantitative questions that were mandatory. So do you believe that Northern Ireland has a problem with attitudes of sexism and misogyny? And very clearly, women agreed with this as 90%, almost 90% said yes. 9.5% were unsure and just 0.8% said no. So we do think that some education does need to go on to accompany this strategy either way to ensure that people are fully aware of what these terms mean, what sort of behaviours and actions will be included in this and more. But I'll just move on then.
So the next one was a question about whether Northern Ireland has a problem with rape myths and rape culture. I know from experience that a lot of people don't understand what those terms mean. And if you're deeply embedded in this work, like myself and Rachel are, we immediately know what they mean, but plenty of people might not. So rape myths are sort of untrue things that people often believe about sexual violence, such as, for example, the idea that if a person doesn't scream and shout, that it's not really without their consent. That's a myth. But you would have to explain that in advance. And one of the problems is that people sometimes get defensive about these terms. Rape culture, people often say things like, well, we don't have a culture that endorses or celebrates rape. And that is not really what the term means. It means that we normalise certain things and turn a blind eye to certain things that allow these things to be almost consequence-free. And if you look at our conviction rates, you can see that it is almost consequence-free. But at any rate, 80.8% still said yes. We do have a significant number of people unsure, and we're not sure whether they aren't sure about the terminology or if they aren't sure if Northern Ireland has a problem with it. Either way, it needs more work to be done on it.
So next we asked, do you believe that Northern Ireland has a problem with victim blaming? And there was a lot more support for this question. So 78.4% believe yes, Northern Ireland does have a problem with victim blaming. 11% again were unsure, but just 1.6% said no. And this is reflective across all of these questions up to now. The no responses are very minimal. So I think either it shows, that a lot of women are in agreement with these issues, or that more work needs to be done to ensure that there's greater understanding.
So after that, we asked the really interesting questions from the point of view of prevention. What do you think are the root causes of sexism, misogyny, victim blaming, rape myths, rape culture? And this was a written response, and it wasn't obligatory, but we still got 828 responses. Some of them very detailed, some of them fairly brief. So we have to go through these in a great lot more detail with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that we're really getting the lessons. But tellingly, 63% of the responses mentioned one of these 5 causes: lack of education, often specifically mentioning the type of RSE they got or didn't get in school, and what they think needs to be done instead. The culture, patriarchy in general, religious attitudes, which often is tied with a cultural issue that prevents people from talking openly about these things and encourages the internalizing of blame. And then generational attitudes. There was often a feeling that some of this will pass away over time, as certain attitudes become less popular. Not too sure about that one. But the lack of education is, of all of these, the most popular by far, with 174 individual responses.
Then we asked whether women believe that there is a stigma surrounding issues of violence against women and girls, and again, 81.2% said yes. A significant proportion of unsure here, 15.5%, and then 3.3% saying no. And we can't decipher then out of those saying no whether it's because they think there's not a stigma because more of us are talking about it and we're calling it out, or whether it's because they don't believe it's an issue. But still, 81.2% said yes, that there is a stigma surrounding issues of violence against women and girls in Northern Ireland.
So then we asked, why do you think there is a stigma, if you think there's a stigma? And we got 680 written responses. Again, it's hard to get through all of these, but they fall into a few different sort of headings. That includes defensiveness by men, or a feeling of defensiveness over men. Like, I love lots of men and they would never do this, that kind of feeling. There's also misogyny in general. There's a lack of compassion, a lack of understanding for other people's experiences, and you see that with the "why didn't she just leave" kind of narrative. The vilification of people who speak out, lack of respect for women in general, shame, and that's often internalized, as well as feeling a shame if it happens within your family. Is linked to stigma around mental health, because of course mental health issues can flow from traumatic violent experiences. Society doesn't support or believe victims. That's connected with victim blaming and a lack of understanding of what it is like to be a victim.
We then asked whether people believe that there are barriers to reporting when they have been victims of men's violence against women and girls, and huge 92.3% said yes. Very clearly, women are saying that there are barriers to them reporting when these levels of violence happen to them. 6.8% were unsure, and less than 1% said no, that there were not barriers.
So then we asked people, what do you think are the barriers, if you have said yes to there being barriers? And top of the list by far were concerns about being believed. And this has come out in every single survey and this issue that's ever been done in almost every jurisdiction in the world. The first thing people think is they won't believe me. And this is particularly true whether in a case of the type of violence where there is no obvious physical evidence, such as very often sexual violence. We also had fear, and that can be fear of what will happen next, a fear of consequences, a fear of retaliation. That's particularly true in domestic abuse cases, or where the person who's abused you or been violent to you is a person with power. Also shame, and again, internalized shame. There's victim blaming narratives, and then there's stigma. And that's 79.8% of the responses mentioned one of these 5 causes. And we'll do more analysis to break down some of the other things people have told us.
So then we asked whether they thought that reducing levels of violence against women and girls requires focusing on changing men and boys' behaviours and actions. And this is one of the strongest responses we had to any question in this survey. 95.2% of women believed that to solve levels of violence against women and girls, it required focusing on men and boys. For way too long, we have focused on the behaviour of women and told women how to do things safely and how to not be attacked and not be assaulted. and quite clearly that the women have said to us now that that needs to change. The focus needs to be on men and boys' behaviour and actions, and that is why we will be recommending that this should be called a strategy tackling men's violence against women and girls, because just calling it violence against women and girls very much then, we would argue, has no active agent. It's like this violence just happens without actually addressing who's doing it in the first place. While we do very firmly recognise other types of violence that can happen where men are victims, or there are those in same-sex relationships, for example, we will be putting further evidence from this survey into the domestic and sexual abuse strategy. But in terms of a violence against women and girls strategy, it is clear that women want us to be advocating for focusing on changing men and boys' behaviours.
So then we asked, well, what do you think would actually help or be necessary to change men's and boys' actions? Because it is the actions, it's not fundamental to men and boys. And, you know, this goes to the whole not all men response that you sometimes hear to issues around this. We absolutely know that it's not all men, but it's about the behaviour. It's not about the character. It's not about the individual. It's about the behaviour. So if we can stop the behaviours, we've won effectively, because it's not about changing something inherent to men. There's nothing inherent to men or inherent to women that makes them victims or violent people. It's about the behaviour itself and what we turn a blind eye to, what we justify and what we don't prosecute properly. So 63% of the responses mentioned one of these things, specifically education, as a necessary measure. And many of them referenced starting this at a very young age, because they said that these behaviours start in obviously much less harmful forms usually, but they start at a very young age, you know, the age of about 5 or 6. Boys and girls have very different perceptions of their own abilities, their own skills, and what kind of behaviour they can get away with within a primary school setting. And that's from, you know, before they really have a proper understanding of their own gender. So examples included education, the justice system reform, increase of public awareness, legal reform, and that's similar to justice system reform, but I think specifically it means new laws or adjusting laws so that they properly capture the behaviour and capture it early enough for it to be preventative. Tackling sexist societal attitudes, that's difficult to say, and that's ones related to education and public awareness, because education doesn't just happen in the classroom. Education happens in lots of places throughout our lives. And then addressing the portrayal of women in the media. And, you know, I would argue men as well. The way that humans are portrayed in the media gives, I think, false ideas and misleading and damaging ideas to young people.
So just to note, we're almost finished. We're coming towards the end of all of our questions, but we then asked, different groups of marginalised women can face additional types of abuse. For example, disabled women, Black or minority ethnic women, migrant women, LGBT women, traveller women, rural women, etc. Do you think additional action needs to be taken in this strategy to address men's violence against these groups of women? 78.6% very firmly said yes. With this one, though, we had the highest proportion of those being unsure, 17%, with many of those stating later on that was because, you know, we should go to those women directly and say. But I still think that the evidence is strong here that we need to be thinking about things like specialist support for migrant women, specialist support for LGBT women and more.
And that's also borne out in the fact that lots of migrant women are lack the confidence to report when these things happen to them. Sometimes because they're afraid of maybe they've got uncertain migrant status, and also sometimes there's language barriers and all sorts of practical barriers for them reporting these crimes. So then we ask people if please expand on any additional factors that need to be considered. And what additional action needs to be taken to support these women, that's those marginalised women mentioned in the previous question. And that included things like specialist support services, listening to the lived experiences so they can tell us what they want, better knowledge and understanding of the various barriers that they face, and early intervention measures, community-led support so they don't have to go to police, they can get support and help, and an advocate maybe could report on their behalf. Something similar to the hate crime advocates that we have actually in existence to make it safer for people who experience, for example, homophobic attacks to report.
Just to say, at the moment in Northern Ireland, there's only one LGBT worker that works on domestic abuse with very precarious funding, and obviously this is something that needs to be funded long term and more sustainably. But also Northern Ireland is the only part of the UK or Ireland without any specialist domestic abuse support for migrant women specifically. So these are the sort of things that we would be recommending based on this evidence. So then we asked whether there needs to be a review of the justice system and how it treats victims and survivors of men's violence against women and girls, and very firmly, again, 87% said yes. 12.4% said unsure, and less than 1% said no. In response to these questions, we found that women are extremely frustrated with how these crimes are travelling through the justice system, and this is one of the biggest frustrations on areas that need to be reformed: education and the justice system.
It's also something that was a repeat issue in the Gillen review, which was, of course, specifically about how the justice system handles specifically sexual violence. And there was, we're still waiting for some of those recommendations to actually be enacted, including ones on education, but also including some ones that require primary legislation, although some great work has been done in this short mandate that we've had. So the next question we asked was, what sort of changes would you like to see within the justice system in relation to men's violence against women and girls? And this included a range of things like harsher punishment for perpetrators, but also things like not having victim blaming language allowed in court, more support for victims as they go through the system, no references to women's sexual history in court, which technically they aren't supposed to do unless they can argue that it's relevant to the case, which nearly always is accepted, so it happens. Or, things like showing underwear in courtrooms and so on. Addressing the re-traumatisation of victims, and that's the kind of behaviour in a courtroom that can cause that. Higher prosecution rates. Now, this goes back to PPS, that middle stage of the justice system, where there's an incredibly low number of people actually being prosecuted, despite a high number of reports, especially in sexual violence. It's not much better in many other forms of violence as well. And a lot of people drop out of the system, partially because of how long it takes, but mostly because they're afraid of all of these other things together. Protecting the anonymity of victims, and that doesn't just mean the legal anonymity, but the real anonymity. When names get out there, they're out there forever. More representation of women, and this is at a bigger, zoomed out level of what would help these things in the long term, preventative work. And then addressing the myths about the prevalence of false accusations. This is something that has come up again and again in work that I do on the project I work on Raise Your Voice, and work we have done through the Gillen Review implementation team, which I sit on. There is a myth out there. It's one of the rape myths that gets talked about quite a bit. It's one of the ones that Sir John Gillen identified, this idea that false allegations, particularly of sexual violence, are rampant, and that actually the real victims are the young men who are being accused of these crimes. That's something that we need to handle at a society level urgently.
Just to say as well, with all of these recommendations on reform within the justice system, but also around education, one thing that we would recommend to the committee is certainly putting pressure for adequate resource to be allocated to this strategy. We can't have a strategy that just sits on the shelves. To make it operational, there needs to be funding for all of these recommendations. So finally then, we asked, do you believe that state violence against women and girls, for example, things like mother and baby institutions, denying access to reproductive health care, or diminishing women's human rights, should be included within this strategy? Again, overwhelmingly, women believe that this should be the case, with 83.4% saying yes. A further 12.8% were unsure, and just 3.8% said no. State violence clearly then should be included within this, and this includes the denial of rights by the state, but also the enabling of abuse by the state. And I note that today a debate is happening on safe access zones within the Assembly, and that is something that came up again and again and again within this survey, is that the denying of the commissioning of services and also enabling women to be abused while accessing healthcare are matters that should be included in such a strategy. But significantly as well around mother and baby institutions, and apologies for victims and survivors, to ensure that they actually have autonomy over the decisions that happen afterwards and are allowed to be a part of the process. And final question, Elaine.
Honestly, this is the last one. So we asked at the end a sort of a big open question. Is there anything else you'd like to share that you think we should be calling for within the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy response. So there's all sorts of different things here. People have, again, said things we've already answered, like address state violence, more education to address the patriarchal culture, focus on preventative rather than reactive measures. This is one of the ones that is most important to us, because reactive measures can really help individual victims, but preventative measures can help prevent future victims being created. And ultimately, that's where you see a real result 5, 10, 15 years down the line. It doesn't necessarily help, win votes, for example, because you don't see an immediate result, but it's actually what's going to help and what people will be grateful for many years in the future. Again, going back to Rachel's point, that has to come. Preventative work has to come with a resourcing package. There's Violence Against Women and Girls strategy in England and Wales, which is on its second life now, and the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy in Scotland, also called Equally Safe. Both come with robust funding packages that they are specifically funneling into prevention work and work directly with victims and survivors. And that can include things like more spaces in refuges, actual walk-in rape crisis centres that people can go to immediately when they've been a victim of sexual violence and get the counselling rather than just a medical examination. That kind of thing is the norm in every other constituency on these two islands. It is not the norm here. And that is something we really need to be looking deeply into our souls and saying, is that good enough for our sisters and our mothers and our children? Because it's not good enough for our cousins in Birmingham or our cousins in Galway. But anyway, additionally, there was also addressing interrelated forms of violence, and that is to say the ways in which these overlap with each other, like a big complex Venn diagram. Very often, as Rachel alluded to before, a person is not a victim of one instance of violence once. Very often, a person who's experiencing domestic violence is also experiencing sexual violence and coercive control and financial control and lots of other things all at one time. Reforming school curriculums, that fits neatly into prevention work, because it is about changing the making sure that the negative attitudes don't develop in little boys and little girls that allow them to go on to experience these things and perpetrate these things. Funding, again, I've mentioned that one already, and ensuring the strategy is resourced. All of these things, and stronger equality legislation as well to back it all up, would make a significant difference.
One final thing, though, again, around the funding of women's support services. A lot of our own organisations, even this piece of research that hasn't been done in Northern Ireland before, and a lot of the other work that we're doing is going largely unfunded or on very precarious funding. Systemic or long-term sustainable funding needs to be provided to the organisations and communities supporting all women who are victims of men's violence. Now, we're just finishing up with our just a summary then. 91.2% believe Northern Ireland has a problem with violence against women and girls. 97.2% believe we should have a strategy to tackle men's violence against women and girls. 83% of those who responded to our survey have been impacted by this violence, with only 21.4% reporting to the police. 77.4% of those who reported this violence did not find it useful. 92.3% believe there are barriers to reporting men's violence against women and girls. And 95.2% of respondents believed that reducing levels of violence against women and girls absolutely requires focusing on changing men and boys' behaviours and actions.
So finally, in conclusion, you'll be pleased to hear, women and girls are telling us that men's violence against women and girls is prevalent and damaging. It isn't fleeting, it isn't something that takes a few moments. It is damaging. And it's not just damaging to that individual victim, it's damaging to the fabric of society overall. It also contributes to our rates of people within prisons, and that's also something we should be looking to reduce. 1,065 women contributed to this research. It could have been more, and there was a massive rush of responses very quickly in a short space of time, telling us as well that people are very eager to share their experiences and their views. We got an incredible amount of really detailed stories. We saw one earlier on, that was one of many. Some of these things would bring anybody to tears because people really were waiting for an opportunity to pour their hearts out on these experiences. And we'll have more detailed findings and more detailed analysis in our written response to TEO consultation on the VOG strategy. It's going to be enormous, so sorry about that. But also not sorry, because it is We're doing our very, very best to articulate what the women are telling us, because we're aware that many of them won't respond to the survey that's out. This is how they're going to respond, through us. So we take this responsibility seriously.
So then that finishes our presentation. I'm going to stop sharing for you now, but I just want to say thank you very much for listening to us, and I hope it really shines a light on the prevalence of the issue. Northern Ireland has been named the most dangerous part of Europe to be a woman because of the levels of femicide and abuse that we have, and because of our absolutely shockingly low conviction rates for these forms of violence. So we hope you find it useful, and we really hope that some of these recommendations will make it into the final strategy.
Thank you very much, Rachel and Lane. That was very comprehensive, and we're really pleased that you were able to put that information forward today. And I want to thank not just you both, but the Women's Policy Group for all their efforts, and also the 1,065 respondents for answering what I'm sure, as you've already alluded to, were often very difficult questions for them. And as you quoted, pouring their heart and soul into giving those responses. And with that in mind, it's imperative that that information and that feedback and the information you provide today forms a key part to the department's response whenever it comes to formulating the strategy. And I think speaking for everybody when we say that it is imperative that takes place, and to get that level of response in just 25 days is testament to just how emotive and important subject this is, and also to the work that you're doing. I've got a number of questions. I know members will as well. So if you're happy enough, we'll just dive into those. The first one I wanted to I'm interested that you say that there's actually more to the information, and I'd be keen to see that as well in terms of what will be your ultimate strategy, because I'd love to see trends between the marginalised groups and then some of the questions that were asked. Does the questioning go into that level of detail in terms of how experiences of specific marginalised groups are affected in terms of the way potentially the age that they come up against sexual or violence, or the types of violence that they are being subjected to? Is that covered within that, Rachel?
Yes, so we are able to pull together that data because we can track then from the beginning whether they identified as LGBT, disabled, migrant, or whatever the different marginalised background was, and then what their responses were throughout. So I think for our very initial response to the call for views, we will be putting as much information in there as possible, but we certainly are going to break down to try and look at other additional trends afterwards. One thing that we did find across the board, regardless of background, was that the vast majority, I think it was 82% of women that responded, have become a victim of men's violence, either in childhood or throughout their teenage years. Then within the qualitative responses, we had hundreds talking specifically about additional factors like racial abuse, homophobic, transphobic abuse. So certainly we will be able to go into more detail on all of that, and we'll be happy to share when we can. It's just going to take a bit of time, unfortunately, with the end of the mandate and every department asking us to submit evidence on different things. We're a bit challenged.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Time is against us in that respect, but I'm really pleased that it's able to do that, because I think if we're able to tease out some of those key trends, it would enable the strategy to be really targeted in its approach if there were areas or specific groups that were being affected in a certain way. And I think it would be a real shame if it couldn't use that data, yeah. So appreciate that. In terms of the department itself, how well do you think it's engaged with the women's sector, your policy group itself, and how would you like to be engaged with better going forward in terms of developing this strategy?
Elaine, if you don't mind, I'll start on that one because this is my spiel, and then we'll hand over to you.
Go for it.
Yeah, this is like my pet peeve, my main project. Basically, our engagement, not just with TEO, but with all departments and all committees to date, has been really poor since the mandate has come up and running again. I have prepared a briefing which we've published and sent to TEO, which specifically calls out TEO on their lack of engagement and lack of actually meaningful engagement with women, not just on this, but other really significant strategies like skills strategy or COVID recovery plan or a draft budget or whatever it may be. So basically all good practice has gone out the window. I mentioned this earlier. There's supposed to be a minimum of 12 weeks for any public consultation. This one, I believe, was 8, and then there was a slight extension. But as has been the case with almost every single one up to now, it started off at 4 or 5 weeks. We're expected to then go and try and get this level of data in that short amount of time, analyse it all, interview women, and ensure their voices are heard. And it's just, frankly, it's not possible. TEO, for example, in relation to COVID recovery, gave us 5 days to respond to the COVID recovery plan. This was despite us releasing a feminist recovery plan the year before. Then when we submitted an equality complaint for not abiding by Section 75 equality screening duties, we were given 3 days notice to respond to that. So you can see how far short we're falling from the 12 weeks, which is good practice. We appreciate the time's running out in the mandate and there's much more legislation going through than ever before. But with all due respect, that is not the fault of the women's sector or the women who have a right to have their voices heard. So it's been extremely challenging. And I think moving forward, we have said over and over again, we want to be able to share this data, provide our expertise, share the voices of women and ensure that they're at the core. And WRDA have got guidelines for public authorities on putting women at the heart of public consultation. So we would really hope that they would be embedded throughout all of the rest of the development of this strategy. I'll hand over to Elaine, but that's my bit on that to start with.
The one thing I want to add to that is just how strange and jarring it is that this strategy was agreed on in principle in the end of March in 2021. And it was December before, work properly began on it. And in all of that time, and I'm aware that some staff may not have been in place yet, but in all of that time, we were constantly wondering what was happening with it, asking questions about what was happening with it. It was going nowhere. And then all of a sudden it happened in a rush. And there was far too much of who should be in the room, and then whoever was already in the room and who they knew and who they had relationships with were the ones who got invited next time. It was far too scattershot, far too last minute, far too rushed. And it didn't have to be that way. That's the most frustrating thing about it. Yes, we're running out of time in this mandate, but this strategy is crossing into the next mandate by necessity. It didn't have to be so rushed. Nothing has to be, all of these timescales are imposed by people other than us. And again, going back to that issue about funding, an awful lot of the people working on this right now don't know if they're going to have a job in April, or if they're going to, they genuinely don't know if they'll have a job in a month's time. It's that year-on-year funding, it's that up in the air thing that relies on, what frustrates me most about it is it relies again and again on the fact that people know that an awful lot of the women in this sector are doing it because they feel a sense of duty and they feel like they can actually help people. So they're going to turn up and they're going to put in their best effort, regardless of whether they're remunerated at all, let alone sufficiently, and regardless of whether people are listening. So we put together massive, massive volumes of work again and again and again and send them in, and we're acutely aware that the chances of them all being read, let alone acted upon, are slim. But you have to do it because you've got to do your best. And I think on the other side of that, we feel like people know that and take advantage of it because the work will be there when they decide they're going to look at it. But other than that, you don't need to actually pay that much attention to the women's sector. They're always there. They're always complaining. They'll still be there when we want to listen to them. And I'm sorry if that sounds very direct, but this is kind of our perception.
No, not direct at all. I think it's important to be direct, Elaine, and we thank you and Rachel for that. I've no doubt departmental officials will be watching this either live or playing it back, and I think it's important that they hear that message. I mean, you're absolutely right in saying this strategy will straddle 2 mandates, so there is the time to do the necessary consultation and engagement and ensure that it's not rushed. And I suppose it leads me to my next question, which was, we have been told by the department that this was in January, that it would take to the end of this year to develop that strategy. I mean, do you think that's too long? Or I'm sensing from what you're saying that it's better to get it right in terms with proper engagement than rush it through. I'm curious to get an answer on that. And in terms of the engagement and the feed into a process, can you identify maybe where else are examples of best practice in terms of where engagement has worked well in formulating that strategy?
So going at this from the start, I would say it doesn't have to take another year or close to another year to actually get a strategy out there, because, as you've alluded to, there's violence against women and girls strategies all over the place. Lots of countries have already done them. They've had them in place for years. They've reviewed them. They've had second versions and so on. It doesn't require reinventing the wheel, although there are, of course, very specific things about our specific society that need attention, but that's the kind of stuff that we're doing right now. So we're putting our best foot forward in terms of all the evidence and all the research that we have, not really 100% clear on why it takes another 9 months to actually turn it into a strategy. I'm aware that they're going to write a draft strategy and then put it out there, but I suppose my question is, why is it going to take so long to go from the call for views into the writing of the strategy? And then that strategy itself will go out for consultation, and then it'll be analysed and so on, and then eventually, one hopes, acted upon. But again, the question is, I don't understand why some civil service will give themselves lengthy periods of time to analyse the responses that they get, but very short spaces of time for the public to feed in and for other sectors like our own to feed in. And it just doesn't strike me that the balance is right. I feel like it could be done in a more efficient manner if the correct resources were put into it. And those resources might be woman and manpower, and it might be something else. I'm not exactly sure. But one thing that would be very valuable is looking at strategies elsewhere where they have worked well, what parts of them have worked well. One of the things that has worked particularly well about in Scotland, where they've only had a strategy since 2017, was they agreed to set baseline measures and to come back 1 year later and look at how things had appeared on that baseline and where resources would need to be targeted thereafter. So instead of putting a huge amount of effort into the strategy itself and then leaving it for 5 or 10 years, the way it happened in England and Wales, Scotland, which came along a little bit later, realised more frequent short-term targeted reviews actually might result in better outcomes. So that's something we could learn from the Scottish example, have a review after a year of how well it's working and where the resources may need to be targeted for better efficiency. But one thing that absolutely has to be a part of it is a resourcing package, and we're going to have to keep banging that drum until we know what's going to be attached. And I would strongly recommend that that goes into whatever public document goes out for consultation in the autumn of next year or this year or whenever it is that's going out.
I just said, and I would also strongly recommend that that is a recommendation that goes into the TEO committee legacy report to ensure that that isn't something that just sits by while the election period is upon us. There is work that can continue going on in the background anyway in relation to this. So yes, I can't see the strategy actually being ready any sooner than the end of this year. But again, if you look at our turnaround, we had 25 days to get that data. 2 weeks later, we presented preliminary results to you. In 2 weeks' time, we're going to have our full report and recommendations in. And that's a women's policy group, which is 60 plus experts working on something. You know, we have a lot of the recommendations sitting there with our colleagues who specifically work in this sector and could very much be heavily involved from the outset. One thing I would recommend between now and the autumn, when it's due to go out to public consultation, is that targeted stakeholder groups should be the core here. There should be significant, meaningful engagement being the priority with women from all of the different backgrounds that we have surveyed on the different trends and areas where they've been impacted. Women's lived experience is going to be key to changing this problem that we have in our society. And something that we didn't get to go into much detail on in our presentation, but will in our final report, is these new emerging trends of huge issues in Northern Ireland that haven't been really as much of a case elsewhere. So for example, forms of honour-based abuse, which are being connected to paramilitaries, where women are terrified of reporting their abusers, or they're getting threatened in unique situations because of the post-conflict society that we're in. Or we're seeing huge levels of image-based sexual assault. We're seeing technology being used in new ways to bribe, harass and threaten women, and a whole range of other new trends that currently none of our legislation is equipped to deal with. So it's something that needs to be in the strategy, as Elaine said, where we can even start reporting it in the first year, get an idea of the scope of the problem, then be able in the next mandate to draft the proper legislation to deal with these issues.
Thanks for that, Rachel. I have one more short question, and I'm going to let members come in because I think we've all got quite a number. But you touched on it during your presentation about the overlap between the violence against women and girls strategy and the domestic and sexual abuse strategy, the fact that it's being consulted at the same time. Do you think this is confusing to have the two strategies going at the same time, or do you think there's enough crossover or sufficient crossover between the two to now
Yeah.
outcome.
By sure, extremely confusing. Even we were confused. So, and it's just frustrating. It's a concern that we raised in December when we first heard that call for views were going to be going out on both, was that people are going to be extremely confused when you're putting both of these out at once, especially because there's no clear idea of whether what is going to specifically be included in the violence against women and girls strategy. Obviously, there's significant aspects of violence, and Elaine will probably touch on some of the problematic terms around sexual abuse being in one strategy. But people, if we're working on this every single day and we are confused on which strategy is covering what issue, can you imagine how much more inaccessible that is for people who are not sitting on the Assembly website trying to work out which consultation to respond to? The fact that there's like 3 different public surveys at once on 2 different strategies, but within one response, I really think that it is challenging. Obviously, we're coming to the end of the mandate. I can see why it was done, and the other strategy is running out. But I just wish that work had have begun on this strategy right after the motion was agreed last March on International Women's Day. There could have been a significant amount of work being done, and I feel like a year was just wasted. So yeah, a lot of confusion.
Can I also say a further aspect of confusion is the fact that it's called a domestic and sexual abuse strategy. Sexual abuse is a phrase that people associate with the abuse of children, systematic abuse like trafficking and so on, and potentially sexual abuse within domestic abusive relationships. They wouldn't experience an encounter with a stranger on a bus who gropes them sexual abuse. They would describe that as groping or sexual harassment. So where does that fall? Is that violence against women or is it sexual abuse? Because the phrase sexual abuse is probably the inappropriate phrase to use in the first place when they mean sexual violence, which covers the gamut from groping a stranger on a bus to systematically abusing and trafficking children and everything in between. That is the correct term that should be used, or else no term. But because they've put sexual abuse and domestic abuse in the same strategy, it can either lead to confusion where people don't feel like their issue and their experience falls into that category, or it can lead to a sort of unintentional hierarchy of victims, so that a victim who was abused by somebody within their home or within their family or who they were in a relationship with is considered worthy of a strategy of their own, whereas a victim who was abused by a stranger whose name they might never know, or by somebody they had a casual encounter with, that person doesn't count in the same way. And we need to be very clear that sexual violence can happen to any person in any context, whether it's a one-off incident or something that happens within relationships. And it taps into 1,000,001 rape myths about the perfect victim and so on as well. It's really, really problematic. I don't think it should be called a sexual and domestic abuse strategy, because sexual abuse has connotations other than all forms of sexual violence. So people who want to respond to this won't know which survey to respond to, and we're ending up having to duplicate a lot of our material across both responses to make sure it fits into the right one, because we're not sure where they belong either.
Just to say though as well, we are very firmly supportive of both strategies. We want to be really clear on that. We're just trying to constructively say ways where it could lead to more meaningful engagement if things were clearer and could potentially have better results.
There's also something kind of incoherent about turning to a person whose only experience of violence might have been within a domestic relationship and saying, sorry, but your issue is not violence against women and girls, it's something else. It absolutely is. It's just happened within a particular context with its own particular circumstances. But that's true of every form of this violence. So there's a degree to which that clarity needs to be made, so that we're not trying to say, some of the questions are phrased in such a way that it says experiences that aren't covered by the domestic and sexual abuse strategy. But, it's not even 100% clear what is covered by that. So it's terminology, it's making it clear to members of the public, particularly to victims, and not using legalese, I suppose, to get around being direct with people.
Okay. Thank you for that answer, Elaine and Rachel. I'm going to pass over to a number of members who want to come in and ask questions, if that's okay. First up is Pat Sheehan.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Rachel and Elaine, for your presentation today. And a significant number of the contributors to the survey said that the focus should be on preventative measures. And of course, early prevention is a key objective of the strategy. So what role would you see for a standardised mandatory curriculum for RSE in schools? You know, something that would teach children about consent and tackle gender norms and rape myths and things like that. Thanks.
If I can start that one, that is the single most important building block in all of this process. It changes everything by making sure that those attitudes don't have to be taken away from, you know, somebody who's maybe gone through life, developed certain beliefs, engaged in certain practices, maybe found themselves in the wrong end of the justice system. It's almost too late, or it's not too late, but it's a whole job of work to try and unconvince them of those beliefs that are motivating the behaviours. If you make sure that those behaviours don't develop in the first place, by making sure that the attitudes never develop, you've won the game, really. It's absolutely vital that mandatory RSE that is standardised, covers every single child, no matter what school they go to, and is totally inclusive, obviously age appropriate, but totally inclusive of all kinds of experiences, because not everybody is heterosexual and not everybody's going to have, you know, they get married and that's the end of the story and all of that sort of thing. It needs to be inclusive of all sorts of experiences, totally non-judgmental and informative. It'll do an awful lot of work as well before they start talking about intimate relationships. When they're talking about basic respect for yourself and for other people, the integrity of your own body, what nobody should ever be allowed to do to your body. That kind of thing, which can be handled really well at primary school level. You know, they have little dancing dinosaurs teaching them that nobody's allowed to touch your pants, for example. Children that age can understand it. Sorry, my own youngest is that age right now, and if they can understand it, there's absolutely no way you can't build a bigger curriculum around that that isn't focused on sort of strangers touching you. It's also focused on your responsibility and your responsibility not to, you know, violate other people's bodily integrity. Children are well able for it. Children are intelligent. Children are sponges. They will learn anything. I think a really good curriculum is the single biggest game changer.
Could I just say then in response to that, so we also conducted research last summer as a part of the relaunch of our Feminist Recovery Plan, and at that time we'd surveyed 150 women, and we asked them if they went to school in Northern Ireland, did they receive adequate relationship and sexuality education, and 94% said no. And there was a lot to say about that. The topic of RSE was overwhelmingly the one where we received the most responses about. It is something we're going to expand upon on Friday as we're part of the Women's Parliament, but it's an issue that women are extremely passionate about, but we know that change is needed on and that it needs to be inclusive, particularly because there's so many new forms of abuse that many parents will not feel equipped to deal with. So for example, things like revenge porn, deep fakes, image-based sexual assault, which is what we would call them as, using new forms of technology to abuse people in a sexual way that others may not know how to deal with. We need to be tackling these issues at an early age. The statistics around the amount of young girls being impacted by image-based sexual abuse in schools are absolutely horrific. So yeah, very firmly would support that. And education, particularly RSE, was one of the most common responses we received from all participants.
Yeah, I can also say through the Gillen Review, we are engaging with the Department for Education on this because it was one of Sir John Gillen's recommendations, and the engagement has not been very productive thus far. It was more productive and then has actually taken a few steps backwards with regards to productiveness. This is, for me, this is not a party political issue. This is an issue for, you know, for safety, public safety, and it's imperative that we get it right and we do it as soon as possible.
Yeah, and I agree with you that education is crucial in this. And just by coincidence, I'm on the Education Committee, and we have been dealing with the passage of the provision of period products bill, and we've been speaking to groups of young people. And one of the deficits in this bill is that it doesn't have an educational element to it. And in our discussions with young people, we've discovered that when it comes to speaking to girls about their menstruation, usually they're separated from the boys, and it's dealt with in that context. Whereas, that sort of continues the mystery around menstruation and the stigma that's attached to it and so on. And it would be much better if the boys were included in whatever discussions are taking place about it. So anyway, thanks for your presentation. I've no question there, just commenting on that. So thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Trevor, Don?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And Rachel, Elaine, thank you very much for your presentation. It was certainly comprehensive. Pat has mentioned the education word, not surely at the back of this. It should be front and centre, because if men and boys were properly educated in these matters, it would introduce an element of peer pressure for a start, because these things are not. These offences are not always individually caused. They're caused by a group of men. I think, you could reach the point where men would try and stop men from doing things that perhaps at the moment they feel free to do. And that leads me on to my real question here. This was a survey of women's attitudes and women's response. So had you thought about some sort of a survey to find out what men think? Because if you now hold on a minute, if you're going to try and rectify men's impressions and perceptions of what's right and wrong, you really need to know surely what their impressions and perceptions are now. So
I would just start off there. So I firmly agree that we do need to know what men's perceptions are, but equally with respect, we're the Women's Policy Group, and there's a wide range of organisations in Northern Ireland who support men. So this will be an ample opportunity for those organisations, many of whom we work with in collaboration, to undertake this piece of research. For us, we just really have been struggling with capacity, and because we wanted to ensure the voices of women were included in our response as the Women's Policy Group, that is why in this instance we chose to just ask women their opinions. In the past, we have had our research open to men and women, and that has been successful too, but it really came down to a resource question for us. Yeah. We aren't funded to do this research. We just did it of our own accord on top of the other work that we've been doing. So I very firmly agree. Men's opinion, men do need to be surveyed on this, boys need to be surveyed on this. We just didn't have the capacity to do it, and I think that speaks more about the underfunding and overcapacity of the women's sector more generally, but also that there are other organisations that I would hope would be able to take this on and would be more than happy to help them draft this if our own research is something that will be beneficial.
Yeah, can I also add to that? I totally agree with everything Rachel said, but also on the Raise Your Voice project, which is a project specifically about sexual violence of all sorts, we have done about a year's worth of concentrated work with, we initially worked with women, then we did mixed gender groups, and then we did men and boys, and we've done some work with professional football teams and GA. We're hoping rugby soon as well. Very sort of masculine environments, and we're talking to them about their understandings of things like sexual harassment, what is and what isn't, consent. Is there a sort of grey area? What's the reality of the statistics and so on? Looking at rape myths, looking at victim blaming, and we have found one of the issues that we have is, a lot of the time, these groups come to us either because they perceive that they have a problem and they want to head it off to pass, or because they're actually quite a group of young people, usually, who have put their heads together and realised, this would be good training for us to do, but they're already amenable to the work we're doing anyway. We really need to be reaching more young men. We've done some work with youth groups as well, like Youth Action and so on. What these classes have taught us is that young men want specific types of training about, for example, ways to step in. So we're developing a bystander intervention program that we're rolling out in the spring. Also things like how to be a better ally and how to know when the right time to step up is, and how do you support the community in general in fighting against these kinds of attitudes that cause these behaviours. So we're doing one on those as well, and we're also doing one about online abuse, and not just online abuse as in telling people not to abuse people, but also what do you do when you're in a WhatsApp group and somebody has sent an intimate picture of their girlfriend or the girl they were with last night or whatever. What do you do in that moment? Technically, you've been made party to a crime in some cases. What do you do that's beyond a criminal justice thing? How do you call your friend in, get them to change their behaviour? So we're trying to roll those out. We're hoping to roll those out in the spring. I'm not exactly sure yet. We're waiting on some animations being made. Whether that will be in the end of April or the beginning of May. But we're hoping to get those out for young men because we know that there is a need. Now, with that said, all that resource that Rachel has mentioned could make a big difference to feeding into that survey, but we don't have the resource to do that. In fact, the project I'm referring to, Raise Your Voice, is only funded until the summer, and after that we've got to find more funding. The funding we have in the first place comes from a charity based in England. We don't get any kind of statutory funding for the work that we do from here, and it's on a shoestring. Everything's on a shoestring. So would love to, but we can't, is the short answer.
Yes, thanks for that. The last time we discussed this, I did a wee bit of reminiscing about the attitudes when I was a young man or a very young man, and obviously now I realised a long time ago that those sort of things were inappropriate and wrong. It seems to me that things have not really improved, and that's what you're about here. And I know you have resource pressures and time pressures, but I think somewhere down the line, I mean, the way to identify the details of a problem is to ask the people who are causing the problem, and you may get some surprising answers, but I think if that was dovetailed with the response you've had from women, and I think your report is absolutely excellent, that it would add to the conversation and might produce a better result.
Oh, I agree. It would add richness to the response, and it would improve the strategy, I would imagine. I think that would need to be built into something that comes after this call for views goes in, because there is no possible way to do it in the time frame we were allowed.
No, indeed, no. Look, thanks very much for your input. It was great.
No worries.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Two more speakers to come in online. Bring in first of all Patrick Delargy.
Just checking, can you hear me okay?
Can indeed, yep. Right on, Patrick.
Yeah, I just wanted to start by thanking you firstly for the presentation. Just, I suppose, to reiterate what Pat had already said. Before I took on this role, I had worked as a primary school teacher, and the NSPCC campaign, which you had mentioned, was one that I was familiar with, and I think that just does emphasise how you can have those conversations. I've worked a fair bit with a number of groups over the past few months, because there has been obviously a huge, there's been a huge increase, particularly in spiking. And so the likes of Stop Street Harassment, and I think that one of the things that they've done, particularly for younger generations, is to put out a message on social media about firstly what you can do to ensure that if you see any instance of that you can report it, how to do it, how best to avoid it, and the likes of that. So I think that getting that message out is very important. And just on the back of that, I did have a question around spiking in particular, because it had been a big issue across the north, and I know it had been at one stage focused on Belfast, but then there had been a huge number of instances in my own constituency in Derry as well. And do you think, I suppose, then that the strategy should include methods to tackle that? Because obviously those are cyclical. There's outbursts of them. Do you think that that's something that should be included?
Yeah, absolutely, Patrick. I think just initially from our research findings, spiking is an issue that came up again and again as something that needs to be included and as a part of a growing issue. And we will be making recommendations on that. One of the things that we will be saying is that we need to see baseline statistics on this. It's something that has grown a lot in the last few months since coming out of lockdowns, but we're also going to be making recommendations in relation to the nighttime economy, what they can do better. More and more times where particularly women are being spiked and being told, oh, they're just too drunk, and then they're being kicked out, which is the most dangerous thing that you can do. But also, what do you do when people working in the nighttime economy are facilitating that type of abuse, those in positions of power? So we will be making recommendations in relation to all of this. And I know it's a growing issue, and we'll be very keen to work with the SUs as well and other student groups and youth groups in particular.
Yeah, can I also add, Westminster did I suppose it was an inquiry, but I think it was more a call for views about spiking just a few months ago, and we responded to that as well. And one of the things that we really stressed in that is it's sometimes very, very hard to tell without baseline monitoring. So we know how common it is on a week-to-week basis before it starts really reaching the public awareness, and then it can almost cause a sort of panic reaction. Or also it can have a really good effect in that it can make people feel like maybe I am safe to respond. Maybe I am safe to report this, because if it's happening to lots of people and I'm just one of many, it's probably not my fault. It's probably the fault of the person abusing me. Now we're sitting here thinking, of course it's that person's fault. They're the one who slipped the thing in your drink. But that's the way victim blaming works, is oftentimes it takes a very publicly visible issue for people to feel safe coming forward. So we would need that monitoring data to be able to tell when these spikes are happening, what they're connected to. Are they connected with a particular, like the way you mentioned, there was a rise in Belfast and then there was a rise in Derry shortly thereafter. Is that a case of some access to whatever the drug is moving to Belfast, suddenly peaking and then dropping off, whereas Derry had it a few weeks later? Is it that, or is it something else? There's no way of telling without having that kind of monitoring thing. One of the things we'd be recommending as well is that there is a sort of contingency fund attached to the strategy, so that when something like this happens and it causes a sudden rise in incidents, a sudden rise in reports, that there's ability there to reach out and help those people in the moment that it happens, not 6 months or 2 years down the line when finally all of the forms have been filled in, but straight away. And finally, also, training for first responders is one of the things we're urging. And that is to say, not just those people working in the nighttime economy who might be the first ones to see it, but also things like the people who will turn up in ambulances, or the people who will be in A&Es the next day, to notice the signs. And this is associated with a number of other things as well, where particular specialist training is useful. For example, non-fatal strangulation. There's a particular fact sheet that can be included that can help people spot the signs easily.
Yeah, no, thanks, and I really appreciate the clarification, and I suppose the fact that you've elaborated around that. I just have one more question, and it's just around the impact that COVID had. Do you think that that's another area that should be included? I suppose my own opinion on it is that we have heard at previous times that there had been an increase in violence against women and girls during the COVID period, but I know from a lot of work that we would have done in terms of safeguarding in school that a lot of that has also gone unreported because it's behind closed doors, and I suppose is that something that you think specifically needs to be looked at within this strategy as well?
Yeah, so sorry, Elaine. I was just going to say that based on the Feminist Recovery Plan, we did research on this, and we asked women whether they had been victims of violence against women and girls throughout the pandemic, and over half of all respondents had been, just during lockdowns. But we know that since March 2020, 12 women have been murdered by a male partner or family member. That now makes us, that's where we get our statistic, the most dangerous place in Europe to be a woman is because of our femicide rates, per population size. But one of the things I think that really enabled a lot of this as well was right at the beginning of the pandemic across England, Scotland and Wales, additional funding was given to support groups like Raise Your Voice, like Women's Aid, their sister organisations, or organisations similar to them were given funding in England, Scotland and Wales. Northern Ireland was the only place that did not allocate any additional funding to service support providers throughout the pandemic. We contacted MPs at the time in March 2020 about it, only to be told that within the executive no bids were being made for this additional funding. So we really need to be assessing where our funding is going in terms of dealing with this issue, how much money is being sent back to Westminster that could have been better placed dealing with the issue of violence against women and girls. And we know that, perpetrators of abuse thrive with isolation. There needs to be things in place to prevent this. When we did our stalking prevention and stalking bill research, we found that stalking had increased throughout the pandemic. A lot of people thought obviously that wouldn't be the case because people associate stalking with stalking a stranger or following someone. Well, online abuse is growing at a rapid rate at the point that our current legislation can't deal with. And that is something that drastically worsened throughout the pandemic. So I'll just go over to Elaine, who no doubt will have a lot more information than me on this.
I'm going to be very brief, and I'll say that on the day that we were all sent home from our workplaces and I was set up at my kitchen table because I didn't have a desk yet, the first thing I did when I got in was make a short animation that would go out on social media networks, giving out the numbers of the emergency helplines for 24-hour domestic and sexual abuse services, for rape crisis, for men's advisory project, and so on, because we knew we had already seen the numbers in from China, which had us locked down first, from Italy and various other European countries where the pandemic had hit before it arrived here. We saw, simultaneous with the lockdown, an incredible rise in domestic abuse statistics. Domestic homicides started increasing in England and Wales specifically. Were worse over here, but within days, people were blaming the stress of lockdown for murdering their wives and so on. It was so inevitable that it would come here, and sure enough, it did. The numbers have gone up as well. Looking closely at police statistics, even reports have gone up of, for example, sexual violence and domestic abuse within the home. So people may not be being, or for a long time, people might not have been being spiked, for example, because they couldn't go out to a club because they weren't open. But that doesn't mean to say that they weren't experiencing sexual violence within the home. And incidentally, since we do mention spiking, there is spiking that happens within domestic relationships as well, and it's rarely called that, but it is that. It's people taking advantage of somebody having taken sleeping pills or having had sleeping pills administered to them, for example, within a domestic relationship. So yes, all around the house to say yes, COVID has definitely affected it. It did everywhere else as well. This is not a Northern Ireland specific phenomenon, and one of the things that could be done, because we don't know what future shocks lie ahead, is build for that contingency. Because that day that I was sitting at home making those videos, the day we first went into lockdown, women's aid shelters in Northern Ireland were at 100% capacity. So right as things were about to hit and get really bad, women's aid could not take any more women in the door. So where do you go with that? And why was it that no department was making bids for additional funding? Why is it that we're sitting here now at the end of the mandate sending extra money back to Westminster? That is just stunning to a sector that is operating on a shoestring and on its knees at 100% capacity 100% of the time, and has been through such a big shock as this, and would think this is the moment where we can rebuild, where we can future-proof ourselves so that if this happens again, we'll be okay. And there's nothing additional forthcoming. This is the time to plan, now that we know what can happen, and it doesn't seem to be happening, but I'll leave it there.
No, thanks very much for that and for going into such detail as well. I think, definitely any of the issues I've raised, I've got a better understanding from that, and obviously there's still a lot of work that we can do on that. So thanks very much for your presentation, for the answers.
Thanks.
Thanks, Padraig. Can we bring Diane Dodds into the spotlight, please? Who's our final speaker? Diane?
Yes, thank you for this. So there's a couple of things that I thought were really interesting and really worrying about the presentation. And that is the percentage of women who responded who had experienced violence, the very young age of women when they first experienced violence, and the number of women who did not report violence to the police. And I suppose those three things, and I have noted them, really jumped out at me from your graphs as the sort of things that we should all be really, really concerned about. And this strategy is helpful, but it will be some time in the making. And I know, Elaine, you said there's a great desire at times to do something new, innovative, etc., etc. But really, we don't really need to reinvent the wheel that much in relation to a strategy for women violence, women and girls in violence. So I suppose there's a few questions that I do want to ask. Is sort of the timescales for the strategy seem to me to be a little bit off in relation to those facts that I've just read out. Secondly, and I've asked this of the head of the civil service and of others, the coordination across the departments in relation to the strategy and how you think that may or may not work. And I'm still not convinced that there is a clear route and mechanism for making that work. I may be pessimistic, but I'm just being honest. I still don't see a clear route. And sometimes I think when we do a very big strategy like this that applies to a number of departments, we get lost in process and we don't get enough outcome. So quite concerned around that. I'm also concerned about what you talk about is a lack of engagement from TEO, but has there been engagement, for example, around from TEO around our justice or health? Or I mean, is this a TEO problem or is it a general malaise? Which I just think that we should clear up as well. There is a great tendency, sorry, I'm asking all the questions at once, apologies. There's a great tendency in government in Northern Ireland to only see what you have on the desk in front of you as your responsibility. And it seems to me that if we are to get anything out of this strategy that really works for women and girls, and it really is very, very sobering to look at the statistics around violence and the number of deaths of women, particularly during the COVID period in Northern Ireland. And if we're to get anything out of that, we will have to have something that's slightly different than what we already have. So it's really interesting to hear your views on this, because if this committee is worth anything, it is about challenging the way we do things to get better outcomes. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I might do a couple of those and then pass over to Rachel for some of the others. One is, I would say, it is not specifically and only a TEO issue, but some departments are better than others. And very often it tends to be the Department of Justice is usually very good, but we have established relationships with Department of Justice on the basis of various pieces of legislation that they've brought through over the past couple of years, through our engagement with Gillen Review and various other things, where the same civil servants are operating many of these things. So they know who you are, they know, gotta get those people in the room. When the issue isn't immediately and obviously a quote unquote women's issue, they won't necessarily think of inviting women's organisations. And this is, around, for example, the draft budget. Why would we need to ask women? This is not specifically a women's issue, as if women aren't also part of the economy and aren't also affected by the budget. So often we find ourselves banging the door to get into the room. And it can take a while before you're allowed in. And then if you're allowed in, you say, okay, I've brought 5 people with me. We all need an invite. We've all got different perspectives. One of these is from a rural group. One is from a migrant group and so on. You're told, no, you pick one. That's what you get. You get one seat at the table and that's a compromise. So, I mean, some departments are worse than others. TEO hasn't been fantastic, but it's not the only one by any means. Some are better than others. And like I say, oftentimes it depends on relationships, which it really shouldn't. It does leave you in a situation where, if those relationships don't exist, or if a new change of personnel comes in on either end, you have to start that from the beginning. Yes, relationships are really useful because people trust each other and so on, but it shouldn't be the be all and the end all, as I'm sure you understand. Personnel move through these jobs all the time. So now I'm losing the run of myself. But that should answer one of the questions. But what I will say is, moving.
Elaine, could I just? Sorry to interrupt you, but I'll lose the question as well in my head. I am a great supporter of women's groups, you know, I have been a long time supporter of places like Shankill Women's Group, Kilcooley Women's Group. They do amazing work, and you're right, the economy isn't just for men, it's for women, it's for everybody. And they do amazing work, particularly with women who may be marginalised. Yeah. And you're a very well recognised advocacy for women. How well do you think that kind of drilling down into the issues for women and reaching out to the wider on the ground? I mean, there's nothing more grounding than sitting around the table with a cup of tea with some women, and like it is absolutely grounding and really brilliant for recognising the issues that are really current in politics. How far down does that reach? Do you ever think that our departments ever reach down and reach out to people who have real experience and real issues? One of the most humbling times I ever spent was giving out awards at a women's centre one day, and one lady came up and she said to me about getting her award, etc., etc. And she pulled up her sleeve and she said, "This is where I came from." And she had self-harmed because of a violent relationship. And those are the kind of things that are really teach you about the difficulties. And I just wonder how many people understand that in the reality and talk to those people.
I think, so can I just say very quickly, Eileen Weir was good enough to give me a lift back from Enniskillen to Belfast the other day, and we were talking about this at great length and how much more valuable strategies and plans and indeed legislation itself would be if there was stronger links between the people drafting it and community. And very often it's left to people like myself and Eileen who can't retire because there's nobody to take her place, going, you know, trying to do those sit down chats. And of course, you're never going to reach everyone. There's not enough resource out there to spend that time sitting down, chatting to people. Tell me, what do you think about this? Sometimes we can do those one-on-one chats, or those, you know, get 10 women in Shankill Women's Centre this week and 10 women in the Falls next week and 10 women in Greenway the week after, and so on. That is time, and that is money, and that is resource that very often isn't there. And it would be so valuable if that kind of outreach was the common practice at all stages. Because, I mean, we're having a Women's Parliament event in the Assembly on Friday, and we're bringing loads of women from loads of women's centres in to talk about their experiences and how these things have affected them. But all of that is a one-off. It's a first. And if that was the common practice, we'd end up with better laws for every single person, not just for those women who are particularly affected, but for everyone. So that's my answer to that one. But I can hear Rachel is about to come in, and I've totally dominated this so far.
No, you're okay. So Diana, I very much agree with what you said. You know, that it's the grassroots women that should be at the core of this. The grassroots women are at the core of the women's sector and the work that we do. And so I work as a lobbyist, and my role is obviously very policy driven, but all of the policy recommendations that I am making and lobbying on are based on the lived experiences of women and them telling us exactly what they want. My issue is that it's very difficult for us to enable that to happen when we're not given time to even ask women what their views are, or to try and facilitate a room where they're brought in and asked directly. And I mentioned earlier about the WRDA guidelines for public authorities. It's 15 guidelines on exactly how to engage with grassroots women. And the basis is, this is how you engage with women's centres. This is how you engage with women's groups. Here's step by step the way to make it accessible. And there's no reason why that couldn't be embodied into the work of every committee. And just to answer an earlier question, you know, it is a TEO problem, and TEO has been probably one of the worst in terms of engagement, but it has been executive wide. So for example, health, we have written to the health minister multiple times since the beginning of the pandemic, been told he can't meet with us. Same with economy, same with education, same with every ministerial position. We've said, look, we've all this data and we've all these women's stories and testimonies you need to hear about. And we just have been told, no, there's not the space. But suddenly now that the mandate is ending in a couple of weeks, I've never been invited to more committees in my life after trying to be in for the last 2 years and being consistently told no. And not even is it just for me. I've been putting in invites to committees to bring women's centres with me to speak and share their experiences, and still have been told over and over again there's not enough time in the committee, in their forward work plan. They have too much to do before the end of the mandate. And I really think that these should be priority issues, because women are dying on a daily basis here. And there's women dying that we don't even know about, who are dying from suicide and other issues after facing horrific abuse that we're not considering up to now. So one thing I think that would make this different to other strategies to overcome the silo issue that the different departments have, this should be something that is so important that it is embedded in the core of our programme for government. This is such a huge issue impacting the majority of people in our society. I firmly believe the only way for it to actually be taken serious by all departments is that if we have it as one of the pillars of our programme for government on transforming our society and the way that we address men's violence against women and girls, because every department has a responsibility here. And we know from our own experience in the women's sector, as soon as something's a women's issue, it gets pushed to DFC, which isn't necessarily the case. You know, this is obviously one that impacts all. It's also an economic issue. We're trying to bring in paid leave for victims of abuse. It's also an education issue. You know, you can go into all of this. So yeah, that was hopefully a bit of an overview of all of the questions that you asked. But just that we have so many ways to include grassroots women. And I think this survey is evidence that they are dying to have a say on this.
Yeah, they are. The second you ask, they'll turn up, and they've lots of opinions, as I'm sure you know from experience, lots of opinions, lots of ideas, lots of solutions. It's just that they rarely get the opportunity to be heard, and we all suffer as a result of that. You know, last minute or asking after the fact just doesn't embed it in the same way. So, yeah.
With your permission, Chair, just the last question. So TEO now has a new PermSec, and it is very well worthwhile for you recording your experiences with him. And I will also, and I'm sure the Chair will agree, that we should also record your views on the level of engagement or non-engagement that there has been, and the way that engagement has been conducted. And I think that is always worth recording that as a matter of course. I think that's quite important. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dan. And yes, I do, and I think other members, not want to speak for them, but I would imagine, judging by what they've said, would also want to record that and pass it on to the new permanent secretary. So I think it's a valid point, well made. Rachel and Liam, just again, thank you so much for taking so long today to... Sorry, Emma, did you want to come in? I got the eyes there, but I wasn't getting hands.
Sorry, John. No, I just wanted to... Obviously, I missed your presentation. I'm really sorry. The Safe Access Zones bill is going through further consideration stage in the Assembly, and I was speaking on that, so I can hear the division bells going. They're voting on it at the minute, and I had made the point during my contribution that, you know, the harassment that we see outside clinics and the harassment that is directed specifically at women accessing abortion services, but at women and others accessing health care in general, is an example of violence against women. So we have to be consistent in our approach towards this. But I just caught the tail end of your answers to Diane there, and I know obviously we had presentations from yourselves as part of the Bill of Rights Committee, and the voice of the women's sector was very much something that we wanted to highlight and give space to, and sort of address the issues, and obviously the report that you produced in terms of the COVID response and the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on women and the intersectional elements of that. But I suppose it's just we've had a lot of good work during this very short mandate in terms of women's rights and addressing some of the inequalities that have been normalised for so long here. And I think that that's a reflection of the fact that we've had so many female ministers. We have had, and you've pointed out to the sort of logjam within specific departments, and I suppose the fact that the DUP blocked us producing a Bill of Rights is an example of the theme across the board there, and you guys know that as well as anybody. So I just thank you very much, and apologies for missing your presentation. I would have enjoyed seeing the finding of those of the survey, so I'm sure I'll get an opportunity to see that, because it didn't come in TP unless it came in this afternoon. So, Gormagat, thank you.
Thanks, Emma.
Just to say, we did send the presentation, so we're happy for that to be shared with you, Emma, if you want to see it. But just one thing to say, I know you missed it, but we had an overwhelmingly positive response to the inclusion of state violence against women, and specifically including denial of reproductive rights, commissioning of abortion services, and enabling abuse of women by preventing safe access zones. So that is something we have the evidence base there to support that private members bill. Also, as you know, in our relaunch of the Feminist Recovery Plan, we surveyed women across Northern Ireland about a Bill of Rights, and they very firmly believed a lot of these issues relating to violence against women, economic injustice and more could be solved through a Bill of Rights, and 98.5% of women said they would or might support it. So yeah, it is disappointing, but as was said in our findings today, we need stronger equality legislation to actually embed strategies like this in our society and give people some form of access to justice.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thanks, Emma, for coming in. Sorry for forgetting about you.
You're all right.
Again, Elaine and Rachel, just to thank you both for taking so much time today. The presentation was very worthwhile, and you can tell by the level of engagement from members and the amount of questions asked that there is that quest for more information from you. And I appreciate you sharing the presentation today, and for offering to pass on more of the detailed presentation as well. If we could see that, that would be very useful. And as a committee, while we're here in this mandate, if there's anything else we can do to continue to further the efforts that you're doing, I think I speak for everyone when I say that we'll do all we can for you. So thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
No bother. Take care. Members, just to wrap this section up, there's a Feminist Recovery Plan in the recommendations to TU in the table pack. You'll have seen that, and I just need to seek your agreement to write to the department for an update on the progress of this. Happy enough? Yep. Okay. Any members, anything they want to comment arising from that? No. Anyone online? Nope. Item 6 then is our next presentation, and Shauna has been eagerly waiting online to see us. And Shauna, I know that you've offered, first of all, welcome along. I can't see you, but we think we can hear you. There. She's on mute. Thank you for coming along. Remember, Shauna's offered, if needs be, given the potential time constraints we might have today, if the current item in the chamber finishes early, to come back next week to give members a better opportunity to get the presentation, ask questions. Are we minded to do that, or I'm in your hands? Yes. There's no grey area there.
Whatever's had enough.
Possibly.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to cut it short because there's probably quite a lot to cover within this, particularly as an update and questions. We could, Michael assures me we can get it on next week's agenda. And Shauna, you'd be happy enough to come along next week?
Yes, no problem.
Thank you very much. We'll appreciate you holding on and for being able to rearrange that, and that would be very beneficial. So we will see you next Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
She did not hang about there.
It's a pity we couldn't have given that information an hour and a half ago. Okay, moving on then is item 7. It's the forward work programme in pages 476 to 480. And just to remind you all members that our last meeting is Wednesday 23rd of March, which is 3 weeks from now. Is everyone happy to note the forward work programme?
Yeah.
Yep. Moving on then, we have 9 items of correspondence at pages 481 to 541 in the meeting pack and 107 to 110 of the pack. Item 8.1 is a letter from the Commissioner for Survivors of Institutional Childhood Abuse, recording their sympathies and condolences on the sad passing of our colleague Christopher Stolford. 8.2 is the Executive Official Office response to historical institutional abuse apology. I just need to remind you members that it's been delivered by Minister Michelle McElveen, Conor Murphy, Nicola Mallon, Robin Swan and Naomi Long in the Assembly Chamber of Parliament Buildings. That'll be next week. 8.3 is the Executive Office response to UK Community Renewal Fund. And can I seek members' agreement to write to the Minister of Finance as Department of Finance in taking the lead in this issue? Happy enough. 8.4 is a letter from Baroness Williams in response to the House of Commons Subcommittee on the Ireland Northern Ireland Protocol Nationality and Borders Bill. 8.5 is a letter from the House of Commons, or House of Lords Subcommittee on the Ireland Northern Ireland Protocol to Lord True on the Elections Bill. 8.6 is Northern Ireland Fiscal Council Stakeholder Engagement and Forward Work Plan Report. 8.7 is the Executive Office News Release Statement from Minister delivering historical institutional abuse apology. 8.8 is the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission draft strategy for 22 to 25. 8.9 is the Minister for Finance response sub-regional stadia programme for soccer. And 8.10 is the Minister of State's speech to the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly on the 28th of February 2022. Are you content to note the correspondence?
Yes.
Yes. Good. And item 9, any other business? I have none at this stage, apart from what was covered in the Chairman's remarks. Does anybody else have anything?
No.
Michael? Nothing. And anything online? Silence. No problem. Our date and time then of the next meeting is Wednesday the 9th of March. And thank you everyone for coming along today.
Thank you.
Thanks now.